We are building the welcome message project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. In fact, we are almost at the final stages now. Remember, we previously built this deep validate function, which gets called if my preliminary validation has, let's say, happened, and we assume that deep validation is happening on, let's say, some kind of a remote server. So I will, previously we wrote this function. Now we will make this a part of the code so that this runs as a single flow. Now, clearly, we will call the deep validate function from the validate function, assuming the preliminary validation passes, which is already set up here. Remember this try except else. If I'm in this else statement, I go and say, well, looking good so far. I am sending this for deeper validation. And the way I, do that is I just put a condition here that I just put a statement here, opening connection to a remote say server. Now remember, in this case it's just notional, but anyway, I just say open a connection to remote server because I'm running deep validation for you. Remember, however, that deep validation itself could fail, as we saw. In fact, more likely than not, it will fail with the numbers we have taken. You can change those. So I'm going to say, well, please try for me, if there is a deep validation success or a failure. How will I know there's a failure? So I just go and say, well, deep validate, I must have these two brackets and I must pass the prelim data to the deep validate, right? So I pass the prelim data dictionary to the deep validate. I'm telling, well, try to validate this function, try to validate, let's say, what I have received from a user, except if there is a value error. Now, how do I know it will be a value error? Well, so if I say value error, let's say I can, say, well, look, something has failed. How do I know it will be a value error? Well, remember, in my deep validate function, if my length of the shortcode is less than a threshold, if my name strength is less than a threshold, then I am raising the value error, and hence I know that my deep validate function can return me this error. So if it goes through, very good. If not, there will be a value error, and I can catch that and tell my user, look, there is something there is something, say, deeply wrong. There's something deeply wrong, and I just say, well, validation has failed, right? So print, let's say, validation has, say, failed. On the other hand, if my do not get, let's say, this value error, it means that my, assuming everything else is correct. And remember, in this case, I am the one passing data to the, let's say, the function. So I assume that everything has been validated previously. It's all correct. If I do not get a value error, it means that I'm not getting any other error. So I just put an else statement. Remember, else happens when there is no error, which means my deep validation ran, implemented successfully, and hence I come into the else. I can just go and print a contract, put a print statement saying congrats, let's say validation successful. But the chances of this, of course, is very, very small in the present game, unless you create like a really, really long, let's say short code and give me a very, very powerful name. You know how those things are calculated, but nonetheless, that's the story. And I can then also congratulations, so let's say congrats. And I can put welcome to my world. Now this is the elusive, welcome message that we have been talking about all this while, that I get this welcome message after having gone through this, very onerous process of, let's say, validation. Remember, however, that my deep validation could fail, my deep validation could pass, but since my deep validation is running on a remote server, I must close the connection regardless. And this is actually very, very important in practice. Probably sometimes I might go and look for a file somewhere in a file system. I might set up a connection. Maybe I don't find the file. That's possible. But no matter what happens, I must close the connection to the deep server, to the remote server, so that my system remains stable, and I can use it in a nice manner. And why do I bring this point up? Because I am going to put this inside the finally. I'm going to say, well, print, this is just a notional thing right now, closing connection to the remote server. Now, why do we put this in finally? Well, because remember, finally, the code inside the finally clause runs no matter whether there's an error or there is no error, right? So which means that even if I have an error or my validation goes successfully, in both the cases, I will close the connection to the remote server, which is very, very, very important in order to keep my application safe and working. In fact, this is now done, but notice carefully, this try and except is actually nested inside the previous one. I come into the else clause of this, which means everything has gone well from the beginning, and then I go and call for deep validation. Let's just let's just try this code. So let me just try to create, let's say, a short code for myself. Okay, let's just try, so I create a short code. Let's say I give, maybe a very long, let's say, suffix, brilliant and smart, and let's say super, right? Because I want the short code to be quite long. Hopefully this is good enough. Maybe I can give let's say smart and let's say well, whatever, intelligent, right? So this is my prefix and suffix. When I do this, you're not good at typing, are you? I hope I've passed this stage. Oh, because I've got something extra coming out here. Never mind, I think this should be okay. My name strength, let me just try to again boost it up quite a bit. So I get, well, let's say name strength, so name strength, let's say name, let me just maybe I put my real name with, let's say, my surname. So I just try to fool the system a little bit. I put my name including my surname, and I know that those alias and aka gives me a lot of points, so I will put, let's say, a large, say brilliant and let's say smart and hardworking. I mean, how much do I praise myself? And let's say intelligent, let's say person. Hopefully that is good enough to get me through. And let's say I also give, and let's say AKA is, let's say, Mr. Bombastic, right? And I've just also put fantastic here. I mean, can't be hurting me. So I have hopefully covered myself enough to get a good name score as well. In fact, I can check how much I've got. So I've got my short form looks long enough. Hopefully it's good enough. My NS is, let's say, looks large enough. For sure, I should be able to get NS, okay. Now I will try to validate this. Remember, my validate function has to be sent with those two, let's say, exactly the way I have mentioned. So SC should be equal to SF. That's all right. But this should be equal to NS. This should be NS equals to NS because this is a keyword argument. When I send this for validation, oops, I unfortunately failed here because my threshold for, let's say, basically I had a long enough shortcode, but clearly my threshold for, shortcode was 100 and I didn't really get that, right? So I can fix this, but you notice I got a message, validation failed, something deeply wrong. And I'll fix this error. So it says validation has failed, but basically validation has failed. However, notice very carefully that my connection to the remote server has indeed been closed. Let's just try to make this pass. So I'll make my short code even longer. Let's say, and I put some more suffix. How much should I praise myself? Let's say, maybe I'll put hardworking and founder of YByte, and coding, say, teacher. Teacher. Hopefully this is now good enough. So I will remove this mid so that I don't get that nasty message coming back from my function. Hopefully this stage is good enough. Now when I try to validate, let's see what happens. Wow, I got it. It says welcome to my world. I finally got this welcome message that I had been so hard to, I've been trying so hard to get, right? But I hope you get the idea that this function, is now working. It's got me a message, and okay, I'm going to make it congrats over here. But notice again that the connection to the remote server has been closed, and that's what I wanted for my application to keep on working correctly. And that's because this is in a finally. I hope this has been interesting to you. This has been a very long journey, lots of concepts. Now, as I discussed in the very beginning, we have tried to put a lot of different concepts in a cohesive framework, which is somewhat, let's say, realistic, which also triggers you to think in a creative manner while you are learning Python, right? So this activity can in fact be enhanced in many, many, many different ways. Let's just look at some of the ways this can be done. Well, you can provide clear instructions with some examples, maybe in a README file. You can raise some custom errors. You can seek even more information before validation. You can write data to a file and read it for validation. You can try creating, for example, let's say a file not found error. So, instead of just checking for assertion that these are none or not, you can actually try to write them in a file and probably read them. And, in case you don't find the file, there's an error. You can try raising different types of errors. You can make the deep validation even more interesting. Remember, that's really like a gotcha movement for us, but we can make it much more interesting. We can add some cosmetic features as though some major prints are going on, some major calculation is going on, and let's say accordingly we validate. Now we can make, in fact, quite interesting deep validation basis on, let's say, some dates. So, I can look at the current time and I can compare that to, let's say, your name strength, your shortcode and so on. And somehow, tell, look, are you passing or not? Maybe you can try after some time and so on. You can provide, let's say, some information on how many people pass this validation. Number is probably very small. You can create different functions. Like I said, shortcode and name strength is just, let's say, an example. You can, explore this and make this quite cohesive, right? Make this, let's say, quite interesting for you. The important point is that we have covered a lot of ground through this activity. However, keep in mind that this is best learned by practice. And that's what I hope this activity has given you. Enjoy this process, make it fun for yourself. Think through every step that we are doing, practice, learn these concepts, they are useful. And also, while this activity is somewhat funny, it's also, end of the day, somewhat realistic as well, right? So that's the interesting and think through it and enjoy yourself. If you think this way of learning, where we build activities, apply concepts, is fun for you, look at our website, www.ybyte.in, because that is how we learn Python programming. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.